Hi everyone. So in this episode, I'm focusing on Johann Reuchlin and his nephew Philip Melanchthon and how they related to the Reformation and the philosophy of Hegel. Later on in the 18th and 19th century, the philosophy that pretty much changed Western culture. So who was Johann Reuchlin? Reuchlin was a German Catholic humanist and scholar of Greek and Hebrew, whose work also took him to a modern-day Austria, Switzerland, Italy, and France. Most of Reuchlin's career centered on advancing German knowledge of Greek and Hebrew. So Johann Reuchlin was born at Pforzheim in the Black Forest in 1455, where his father was an official of the Dominican monastery. According to the fashion of the time, his name was grace-sized by the Italian friends into Capnion, a nickname which Reuchlin used as a sort of transparent mask when he introduced himself as an interlocutor in the De Verbo Mirifico. So basically, these people would change their name or Latinize their name. He remained fond of his hometown. He constantly calls himself for census, and in the De Verbo, he ascribes to Pforzheim his inclination towards literature. I'm just going to look at his name here because he's Reuchlin. And according to the website Forebears, it says Reuchlin surname user. This is a Swiss German and German surname derived from a pet form of the medieval personal name Reuchlin. It is also a Jewish surname from Belarus, derived from the Yiddish female personal name Rachel, a pet form of Rachel, which in turn is derived from the Yiddish Rake, meaning rich, and the Eastern Slavic possessive suffix. Now, if we copy Rachel, again, the same information. Name meaning some characteristics, forenames Jewish shrew, Swiss German a German from Reuchlin, or Jewish from Belarus, Reuchlin. So you've got KH, Reuchlin, or I guess you could pronounce the CH as a K or as a ch, Reuchlin. So it's highly probable that this guy is Jewish. We'll go on with his history. It says, here he began his Latin studies in the monastery school, and through 1470 he was for a short time in Freiburg. That university seemed to have taught him little. Reuchlin's career as a scholar appears to have turned almost on an accident. His fine voice gained him a place in the household of Charles I, Margrave of Baden, and soon having some reputation as a Latinist, he was chosen to accompany Frederick III, son of the prince, to the University of Paris. Frederick was some years his junior and was destined for an ecclesiastical career. This new connection did not last long, but it determined the course of Reuchlin's life. He now began to learn Greek, which had been taught in the French capital since 1470, and he also attached himself to the leader of the Paris realist Jean A. Lapide, a worthy and learned man whom he followed to the vigorous young University of Basel. Now, if this guy was Jewish or from a rabbi family, we can see that, his father is the official of a Dominican monastery. So there's a lot of infiltration into the church hierarchy. At Basel, Reuchlin took his master's degree and began to lecture with success, teaching more classical Latin than was the common in German schools and explaining Aristotle in Greek. His studies in this language had been continued at Basel under Andronicus Contablacus. And here he formed the acquaintance of the bookseller Johann Amerbach, for whom he prepared a Latin lexicon. So Reuchlin soon left Basel to seek further Greek training with George Hermonymus at Paris, and to learn to write fair Greek hand that he might support himself by copying manuscripts. And now he felt that he must choose a profession. His choice fell on law, and he was thus led to the great school of Orleans, and finally to Poitiers, where he became licentiate in July 1481. From Poitiers, Reuchlin went in December 1481 to Tübingen with the intention of becoming a teacher in the local university, but his friends recommended him to Count Eberhard of Württemberg, who was about to travel to Italy and require an interpreter. Reuchlin was selected for the post, and in February 1482 left Stuttgart for Florence and Rome. The journey lasted but a few months, but it brought the German scholar into contact with several learned Italians, especially at the Medican Academy in Florence. This connection with the Count became permanent, and after his return to Stuttgart, he received important posts at Eberhard's court. About this time, he appeared to have married, but little is known of his married life. He left no children, but in later years, his sister's grandson, Philip Melanchthon, was like a son to him till the Reformation estranged them. In 1490, he was again in Italy. Here he saw Pico della Mirandola, to whose Kabbalistic doctrines he afterwards became heir, and made a friend of the Pope's secretary, Jacob Questenberg, which was of service to him in his later troubles. So what are they saying here? That this guy, these two people he met and introduced him to Kabbalistic doctrines were connected to the Pope, and that the Catholic Church was infiltrated with the Kabbalah? More than likely. 1492, he was employed on an embassy to the Emperor Frederick at Linz, and here he began to read Hebrew with the Emperor's Jewish physician Jacob ben Jehiel Loans, whose instruction laid the basis of thorough knowledge which Reuchlin afterwards improved on his third visit to Rome in 1498 by the instruction of Obadja Sforno of Cesena. In 1494, his rising reputation had been greatly enhanced by the publication of De Verbo Mirifico. So for many years, Reuchlin had been increasingly absorbed in Hebrew studies, which had for him more than mere theological interest. He was interested in the reform of preaching as shown in the De Arte Predicandi, a book which became a sort of preacher's manual. But above all, as a scholar, he was eager that the Bible should be better known and could not tie himself to the authority of the Vulgate. The key to the Hebrea Veritas was the grammatical and exegetical tradition of the medieval rabbis, especially of David Kimi. And when he had mastered this himself, he was resolved to open it to others. In 1506 appeared his epoch-making De Rudimentis Hebraicis, Grammar and Lexicon, mainly after Kimi, yet not a mere copy of one man's teaching. The edition was costly and sold slowly. One great difficulty was that the wars of Maximilian I in Italy prevented Hebrew Bibles coming to Germany. But for this also Reuchlin found help by printing the penitential psalms with grammatical explorations in 1512. And the other help followed from time to time. But his Greek studies had interested him in those fantastical and mystical systems of later times with which the Kabbalah has no small affinity. Following Pico, he seemed to find in the Kabbalah a profound theosophy which might be of the greatest service for the defense of Christianity and the reconciliation of science with the mysteries of faith, a common notion in the time. Reuchlin's mystico-Kabbalistic ideas and objects were expounded in the De Verbo Mirifico and finally in the De Arte Kabbalistica in 1517. So many of his contemporaries thought that the first step to the conversion of the Jews was to take away their books. This view was advocated by Johannes Pfefferkorn, a German Catholic theologian. This is interesting, this part, because Pfefferkorn himself converted from Judaism, actively preaching against the Jews and attempted to destroy copies of the Talmud, and engaged in what became a long-running pamphleteering battle with Reuchlin. He wrote that the cause which hinder the Jews from becoming Christians are three. First, usury. Second, because they are not compelled to attend Christian churches to hear the sermons. And third, because they honor the Talmud. Pfefferkorn's plans were backed by the Dominicans of Cologne, and in 1509 he obtained the emperor's authority to confiscate all Jewish books directed against the Christian faith. Armed with the mandate, he visited Stuttgart and asked Reuchlin's help as a jurist and expert in putting it into execution. Reuchlin evaded the demand mainly because the mandate lacked certain formalities, but he could no longer remain neutral. The execution of Pfefferkorn's schemes led to difficulties and to a new appeal to Maximilian. Now, I'm going to add my opinion on this here. And if I was reading between the lines here, around this time, we've got issues with the Jews in Europe with the blood libel problems and people finding out about the information in the Talmud and why the Jews simply won't convert to Christianity. We've also got people printing Bibles, which is, saying here, people are starting to translate Hebrew and Greek Bibles. They're starting to get printed and people are starting to understand the Bible. Now, what do these two guys have in common? Well, we've got Pfefferkorn, backed by the Dominicans of Cologne, and we've got Reuchlin, whose father was an official of the Dominican monastery, right? So this is in the Black Forest in Pforzheim, and this guy's the Dominicans of Cologne. Now, I guess you could say, do they have the same agenda? Well, you would assume that they would because they're both Dominicans and they're both part of the Catholic Church. The Dominican order came into being in the Middle Ages at a time when men of God were no longer expected to stay behind the walls of a cloister. Instead, they traveled among the people, taking as their example the apostles of the primitive church. Out of the ideal emerged two orders of mendicant friars. One, the Friars Minor, was led by Francis of Assisi, and the other, Friars Preachers, by Dominic of Guzman. Like his contemporary Francis, Dominic saw the need for a new type of organization, and the quick growth of the Dominicans and Franciscans during their first century of existence confirms that conditions were favorable for the growth of the orders of mendicant friars. The Dominicans and other mendicant orders may have been an adaptation to the rise of the profit economy in medieval Europe. Dominic sought to establish a new kind of order, one that would bring the dedication and systematic education of the older monastic orders like the Benedictines to bear on the religious problems of the burgeoning population of cities, but with more organizational flexibility than either monastic orders of the secular clergy. The Order of Preachers was founded in response to a then perceived need for information preaching. Dominic's new order was to be trained to preach in the vernacular languages. So this is kind of interesting that they're getting out with the people and they saw this need to find out what was going on in the community. I just want to know, is what was going on in the community a problem with blood libel? And I'm sure most of you know what that means, but if you don't, blood libel or ritual murder libel, okay, so this is the Wikipedia version, is an anti-Semitic canard which falsely accuses Jews of murdering Christian boys in order to use their blood in the performance of religious rituals, historically echoing very old myths of secret cultic practices in many prehistoric societies. So blood libel typically claim that Jews require human blood for the baking of matzos, an unleavened flatbread which is eaten during Passover. Although the element of the accusation was allegedly absent in the earliest blood libels in which then contemporary Jews were accused of reenacting the crucifixion, the accusations often assert that the blood of Christian children is especially coveted, and historically blood libel claims have been made in order to account for the otherwise unexplained deaths of children. In some cases, the alleged victim of human sacrifices have become venerated as Christian martyrs. Three of these are William of Norwich, Little Saint Hugh of Lincoln, and Simon of Trent, became objects of local cults and veneration, and although he was never canonized, the veneration of Simon was added to the general Roman calendar. One child who was allegedly murdered by Jews was Gabriel of Bialystok, was canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church. So the Jewish law, blood libel, served as an impetus for the creation of the Golem of Prague by Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel in the 16th century, according to Walter Lacker. Although there have been about 150 recorded cases of blood libel, not to mention thousands of rumors that result in arrests and killing Jews throughout history, most of them in the Middle Ages. In most every case, Jews were murdered, sometimes by a mob, sometimes following torture and trial. We know that the Sabbatean Frankists arrived in this time around the 1600s. So, Sabbatai Zevi, he was born in 1626, died in 1676. We're talking about the same time period. I'm not saying all Jews participate in blood libel, but there certainly are cults of Jews like the Sabbatean Frankists that follow the Talmud. And we all know what's written in the Talmud. That can't be hidden. So, we've had these Jews cast out of Europe for a long time. It says in England, 1444, the Jews of Norwich were falsely accused of ritual murder after a boy, William of Norwich, was found dead in the woods with stab wounds. I won't read too much about it, but so 1444, I think around this time, the English people burnt the Jews and cast them out of England. It says massacres of Jews at London and York followed. After the death of St. Hugh of Lincoln, there were trials and executions of Jews. And it says within a few decades, Jews would be expelled from all of England and not allowed to return until 1657. Around this time that we've got all of this Reformation, and I believe it's King Henry VIII allowed them back into England. And ironically, within 8 years of the Jews being allowed back into England, we've got the Great Fire of London in 1666. And you just got to question, is that some kind of payback for the people of England burning the Jews? In the story, the Jews were backed into a tower and the tower was set on fire. So you've got to question this. And the area that was cleaned out by the fire was then turned into the banking district that we know today as the City of London, the Dragon Bankers. We've got problems being spoken about of blood libel in Germany and Europe around this time. It says Renaissance and Baroque. Simon of Trent, aged 2, disappeared in 1475, and his father alleged he had been kidnapped and murdered by the local Jewish community. 15 local Jews were sentenced to death and burned. Simon was regarded locally as a saint. So in the 19th century, one of the child saints in the Russian Orthodox Church is a 6-year-old boy, Gavril Belostowski, from the village of Zverki. According to the legend supported by the church, the boy was kidnapped from his home during the holiday of Passover while his parents were away. So this is happening all over Europe. This isn't just one place where people are getting angry at Jews and accusing them. I mean, this is Damascus, Rhodes, the island of Rhodes. A little Greek boy was murdered and the Jews were accused under the Ottoman Empire. 1882, so, 20th century. There's a real problem here, because if this is false, why does it keep popping up again? And now we've got these elitists that are accused of doing horrible things to children as well. So this is continental Europe. A statement made in the Chronicle of Conrad Justinger in 1423 that a burn in 1293 or 1294, the Jews tortured and murdered a boy called Rudolph, sometimes also referred to as Rudolph, Ruff, or Roof. The boy was reportedly found by the house of Jolie, a Jew. The Jewish community was then implicated. The penalties imposed upon the Jews included torture, execution, expulsion, and steep financial fines. This has got a huge amount of reason why the Jews were sanctioned in Europe, why they weren't allowed to do things, why a lot of the times they were completely banned from Europe. This and usury. And, during this time of the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Enlightenment, we've got Jewish emancipation coming out. So they do not want this problem between the Jews and the local people. What they want is to give Jews their freedom to control society without sanctions, fines, or restrictions on them, because that's exactly what they did. So what I'm saying about this Reuchlin basically is he seems to have a Jewish surname. His family's linked to these Dominicans. Then we've got this peppercorn popping up, and he's linked to the Dominicans. And in 1509, he obtained the emperor's authority to confiscate all the Jewish books. So why were they creating a Hegalian argument here between a potential Jew and Pfefferkorn, who's a Jewish convert to Catholicism. And they're creating this argument because people were starting to know and understand, in my opinion, what was written in the Talmud and what these people were up to. And so, we've got Pfefferkorn saying, no, we have to ban all the Jewish books. We have to get rid of them. We have to convert them to Christianity. And we've got Reuchlin, who's a Kabbalist on the other side. And it goes on to say, in 1510, Reuchlin was appointed by Emperor Maximilian to commission which was converted to review the matter. His answer is dated from Stuttgart, 6 October 1510. In it, he divides the books into two classes, apart from the Bible, which no one proposed to destroy. And going through each class, he shows that the books openly insulting to Christianity are very few and viewed as worthless by most Jews themselves. Yeah, rubbish. While the others are either works necessary to the Jewish worship, which are licensed by papal as well as imperial law, to contain matter of value and scholarly interest, which ought not to be sacrificed because they are connected with another faith than that of Christians. He proposed that the emperor should decree that for 10 years there should be 2 Hebrew chairs at every German university, for which the Jews should furnish books. Maximilian's other experts proposed that all books should be taken from the Jews, and the emperor still hesitated. His opponents threw on Reuchlin the whole blame of their ill success. Pfefferkorn circulated at the Frankfurt Fair in 1511 a gross libel, declaring that Reuchlin had been bribed. Reuchlin defended himself in a pamphlet titled Orgenspiegel, which the theologians at the University of Cologne attempted to suppress. On 7 October 1512, they, along with the Inquisitor Jacob van Hoogstraten, obtained an imperial order confiscating the Orgenspiegel. In 1513, Reuchlin was summoned before the court of the Inquisition. He was willing to receive corrections in theology, which was not his subject, but he could not unsay what he had said. And as his enemies tried to press him into a corner, he met them with open defiance in Defensio contra Culminatoris. It kind of makes me laugh because these people are so obvious. We've got Orgenspiegel, which basically means eye mirror, and we've got this symbology of the all-seeing Illuminati eye. In 1513, the universities were now appealed to for opinions and were all against Reuchlin. Even Paris condemned the Orgenspiegel and called on Reuchlin to recant. Meantime, a formal process had begun in Mainz before the Grand Inquisitor, but Reuchlin managed to have the jurisdiction changed to the Episcopal Court of Speyer. The Reuchlin affair caused a wide rift in the church, and eventually the case came before the papal court in Rome. Judgment was not finally given till July 1516, and then, though the decision was really for Reuchlin, the trial was simply quashed. Now, can we see the Hegelian argument in this? So we've got Reuchlin and we've got Pfefferkorn, thesis and antithesis, and in the middle we get a synthesis. And eventually, what was the synthesis of this particular argument? It was Jewish emancipation. And all of these following reformers and philosophers out of this time period started fighting for the emancipation of the Jews, which was freedom for them to basically do what they wanted in Europe. They had sanctions on them. They had chains. So what I'm saying here is, if this is the beginning of the little season of Satan, basically they were chained with laws that stopped them from completely taking over the banking system or completely taking over the education and the media and everything that today they are completely embedded in. So after the emancipation of the Jews, basically they were unchained. The dragon was unchained. Now, you know who my opinion on the dragon is, and I believe that it's the dragons of the wilderness who inherited Edom's entitlements. Basically, the Bible tells us this, that the inheritance of Esau went to the dragons of the wilderness. The dragons of the wilderness are the Nabateans. The Nabateans come from Chaldea. They are the Chaldean priesthood, the astrologers. All of these men are into astrology. All of these men have suspect backgrounds that go back to the rabbis. All of these men I believe, are part of these ancient families. These people are related to the dragon. The dragon brings Magog against the saints. Magog is the Scythians, the Ashkenazis. So the dragon in leagues with the Ashkenazis, the Chaldean priesthood in leagues with the Ashkenazi Magog. So Ulrich von Hutten and Franz von Sickingen did all they could to force Reuchlin's enemies to a restitution of his material damages. They even threatened a feud against the Dominicans of Cologne and Spires. In 1520, a commission met in Frankfurt to investigate the case. It condemned Hoogstraten, but the final decision in Rome did not indemnify Reuchlin. The contest ended, however. Public interest had grown cold, absorbed entirely by the Lutheran question, and Reuchlin had no reason to fear new attacks. When in 1517 he received the thesis propounded by Luther, he exclaimed, "Thanks be to God, at last they have found a man who will give them so much to do that they will be compelled to let my old age end in peace." Heinrich Gratz and Francis Yates contended that this affair helped spark the Protestant Reformation. Although suspected of a leaning towards Protestantism, Reuchlin never left the Catholic Church. In 1518, he was appointed professor of Hebrew and Greek in Wittenberg, but instead sent his nephew Melanchthon. So it says that he disowned Melanchthon for his involvement in the Protestant Reformation, and yet he sent his nephew to Wittenberg, and he got involved with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. So it's contradictory. Luther's comment that justification by faith was the true Kabbalah in his commentary on Galatians has been explained as relating to Reuchlin's influence. While Luther had consulted Reuchlin as a Hebrew expert and used De Arte Kabbalistica as support for an argument, Luther took objection to Reuchlin's comment in De Rudimentis Hebraicus that the Hebrew letters for Jesus' name meant the hidden God, which Luther found contrary to Matthew chapter 1:21, which describes the meaning as being about he would save his people from their sins. So in this book, The Preservation of Jewish Religious Books in the 16th Century Germany, Johannes Reuchlin's Eugenspiegel, it says here, while attending the Diet at Worms, Reuchlin received from Bishop Johannes von Dalberg a Hebrew manuscript entitled Hortus Nuncius, the Jewish mystical text by Joseph Gikatila. Moses ben Samuel Ha Cohen attempted to show a relationship between the alphabet and divine names, a subject Reuchlin was to pursue further in the first of his Kabbalistic works, De Verbo Mirifico. It is not known whether Dalberg was also one of those who subscribed privately to Kabbalistic beliefs, but it is noteworthy, however, that in 1494, Reuchlin dedicated his De Verbo Mirifico to Dalberg, which indicates at this stage of his life, Reuchlin could read Hebrew or show an interest in learning it. The bishop obviously did not reprove him in his studies, but encouraged Reuchlin's study of Hebrew and Kabbalism. However, it was his two further journeys to Italy and a diplomatic mission to Linz that were to have the greatest influence on his intellectual development and to his personal beliefs. He made his second journey to Italy in 1490 when he accompanied Ludwig Wittenberger, the illegitimate son of his overlord Eberhard im Bad, to pursue his studies. So we've got this bishop giving him this Kabbalistic book. It's obviously about gematria, how people's names have meaning with numbers. You know, we know a lot of these so-called elitists today love to put gematria in names and dates of birth, etc. On the occasion, he encountered again Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and it was he who confirmed for him that the study of Jewish Kabbalah and Christian beliefs were directly related and could be integrated to an Orthodox Christian philosophy. Could they not integrate it into the Catholic Church? Dare say it already was, but, you know, is this the purpose of creating the Reformation? You know, I think the Reformation's a great thing, but at the time we've got printing, accessibility to the average person of the Bible and the scriptures, and we've got these people trying to contaminate it with the Kabbalah. Reuchlin was a skilled translator of both Greek and Latin. He translated Xenophon's work, which became the first of his numerous translations of Greek into Latin, and which he had later printed while lecturing in Ingolstadt University. He used his profound knowledge of Greek to translate the New Testament, as he indicates in the Eugenspiegel. More importantly, however, for his personal beliefs, he translated many works of classical authors not only as sources of Latin prose written with great perfection, but also to search for evidence that the truths of Christian religion were to be found in writings of classical authors such as Plato and Pythagoras. Says Reuchlin was particularly drawn to Pythagoras' philosophies. So by the time we get to Ferdinand Christian Bauer, we'll see that all of these philosophers with opinions on Christianity and the Reformation have a basis of these Greek philosophers. So not only were they setting up a new religion, they were also setting up a new education system. Now, I'm no Roman Catholic. I'm not condoning or sticking up for the Catholic system that was there or saying that the Reformation system was different. What I am saying is that we've been lied to about the Reformation, and a lot of the people who were involved with the Reformation were actually suspect people. And they had an agenda, and that was, I think, to subvert Christianity. I think that they changed it for the reason being that people were starting to learn the scripture again because of the printing press. So, we just Google up, when was the printing press invented? German goldsmith Johannes Gutenberg is credited with inventing the printing press around 1436. Although he was far from the first to automate the book printing process, woodblock printing in China dates back to the 9th century, and Korean bookmakers were printing with movable metal type a century before Gutenberg. So Gutenberg was a goldsmith. Gutenberg was probably a Jew. But, it's like the internet. We're in a very similar situation today where it's an incredibly powerful tool. Printing was very powerful. It could be used for good or it could be used for bad, just as the internet can be used for good or for bad. And we're in a process today where we're in a book burning situation. When something new comes out and everybody's using it and everything's great, people are printing books with lots of information. People are learning. We've got this sort of Renaissance, Reformation, and basically it needs to be controlled. We've had the same situation. We've had the internet released and it's been available for good and for evil. People use it for bad reasons. We all know what they are. Other people use it for learning. If it wasn't for the internet, most people today in the truth movement or learning about scripture and Bible wouldn't understand history as well, with the easy access of just being able to type something in and click it and find that information out in a matter of minutes. I remember when I was young, if I wanted to learn something, I'd have to go to the library, and sometimes the books weren't available. It would take weeks to get books, and then, you've got to know the right books to get. Sometimes you just get a book that was rubbish. Great books are really hard to come by, but nowadays we can get this all on the internet, or we could get it all on the internet. It's getting harder and harder to find good information. Everything's locked up, and basically we've had an internet book burning where all the good websites have been banned. But my point is that these specific times in history, we as a society have the chance to excel in a positive way or a negative way. And what seems to be the problem is that these people are always there to lead the direction of our culture and society in the way that they want it to go. And they've had the money and the connections and the power to devote all their time and energy to doing so. And I sometimes wonder, this rabbi class, we can trace their family lines back very far into history, going back even to the time of Jesus. And, they've always been academic people and scholars. They've always had books. So it makes me wonder what kind of books they have available to their community and to their hierarchy. possibly ancient books that we don't know anything about, history books. And it seems to be that our information constantly keeps getting destroyed, or, there's book burnings and corruption of history, corruption of religion, corruption of any information that's available to us. Yet the rabbinical class quite possibly have hidden information that they've handed down for generations. Mathematician, astrologer, conjurer. It says things only began to change during the Renaissance when the first universities in northern Italy began to establish chairs for mathematics, which were actually chairs for astrology, because of the demand for astrology for medical students. Now, why would medical students need astrology? The concept of general chairs for mathematics for all education institutions began with Philip Melanchthon in 1497 to 1560. So we know he's the nephew of Johannes Reuchlin, when he set up the school and university system for Lutheran Protestantism to replace the previously existing Catholic education system in the second quarter of the 16th century. Here we've got this guy Melanchthon, who's related to this humanist and Kabbalist. He's also a humanist and Kabbalist. Does a leopard change its spots? Says he had a conversion. I don't really believe it. Melanchthon did so because he was a passionate advocate of astrology, and to do astrology you need astronomy, and to do astronomy you need arithmetic, geometry, and trigonometry. So he installed the full package in the Lutheran schools and universities. He also ensured that the universities provided enough young academic mathematicians to fill the credited positions. Catholic educational institutions had to wait till the end of the 16th century before Christopher Clavius succeeded in getting mathematics integrated into the Jesuit educational program and installed a maths curriculum into Catholic schools, colleges, and universities. Now, I'm not saying that maths is bad, but, we've got this agenda to change the education system, to bring in astrology. We've got humanism, and we all know that this just evolves into Darwinism and a total breakdown of Christian education. I just want to know what's going on here also. It says the Battle of the Books, the Reuchlin-Pfefferkorn debate. The Orgenspiegel is the famous defense of the Christian humanist scholar Johannes Reuchlin against the attacks of the anti-Jewish agitator Johannes Pfefferkorn, a convert from Judaism. So he's a Jew. Pfefferkorn has gained access to the Holy Roman Emperor through the support of the Cologne Dominicans, and in 1509 was empowered to confiscate and burn Jewish books. Where are these people getting all this power from? A rare book collection of Frank L. Hertz, now Hertz is a Rothschild name, focuses on the famous Renaissance controversy between Christian Hebraist and lawyer Johannes Reuchlin, who introduced the study of Hebrew to Germany, and the anti-Jewish agitator Johannes Pfefferkorn, who was a Jew, who was trying to lobby for the destruction of all Jewish books. This controversy was later dubbed the Battle of the Books, and was one of the earliest public international debates about who controls access to information. It had substantial influence on the events which led to the Reformation. So haven't we got this problem going on right now rehashed? Who has control and access to information? The fact checkers? Frank L. Hertz, 1908 to 2006, a passionate collector of Renaissance books, assembled a collection of more than 100 books to write a manuscript on the life and thoughts of Johannes Reuchlin, which is now part of the LBI archives. Hertz was particularly interested in the question of how Reuchlin defended Jewish rights and fought against the anti-Semitism of the Christian church. Okay, no, it wasn't the anti-Semitism of the Christian church. It was a Hegelian argument with Johannes Pfefferkorn, who was a so-called Semite. The German historian Dr. Sybil Quack inherited this rare book collection from Frank L. Hertz and donated it to the library at the Leo Baeck Institute in 2009. Many of the books were published in the early 16th century. Some commentaries reprints date from the 17th century. Private digitization funds were used to digitize 25 seminal 16th century texts from this collection. The centerpiece of the debate is the Orgenspiegel, The famous published defense of the Christian humanist scholar Johannes Reuchlin against the attacks of the anti-Jewish and agitated Johannes Pfefferkorn, a convert from Judaism. Pfefferkorn had gained access to the royal Roman emperor through the support of the Cologne Dominicans, and in 1509 was empowered to confiscate and burn Jewish books as part of the plan to undermine the status of Jews within the empire. When Archbishop of Mainz and the Frankfurt City Council and various German princes intervened on behalf of the Jews, the emperor ordered the appointment of an investigating commission. The commission was headed by the Archbishop of Mainz and Johannes Reuchlin, whose aide Pfefferkorn had tried in vain to enlist earlier. When Pfefferkorn learned that Reuchlin's opinion would be favourable to the Talmud, he assailed him in his hand mirror. 1511, Reuchlin replied with his Augenspiegel eyeglass, strong attacking Pfefferkorn and his backers, and thereby stating one of the great literary controversies of history. In essence, the battle between the reactionary and the liberal parties within the church. So this is an Hegelian agenda here. To me, it's just plain, it's very plain, that's what it is. And the agenda is between the Catholic Church or the Jesuits, the Pharisees or the Jews, and the aristocracy, clearly. Johannes Pfefferkorn was a German Catholic theologian and writer who converted from Judaism. Pfefferkorn actively preached against the Jews and attempted to destroy copies of the Talmud, and engaged in long-running pamphleteering battle with humanist Johann Reuchlin. Why were they trying to gain the opinions of the people? Well, I dare say it's because of the blood libel situation and the fact that the average man was starting to hear real scripture that wasn't read by a priest. And because the Jews had to do damage control so that they could gain Jewish emancipation or freedom from rules that restricted them. Born a Jew, possibly in Nuremberg, Pfefferkorn lived in Nuremberg and moved to Cologne after many years of wandering. After committing a burglary, he was imprisoned and released in 1504. He converted to Catholic Christianity in 1505 and was baptized together with his family. Pfefferkorn became an assistant to the prior of the Dominican Friar Order of Cologne, Jacob van Hoogstraten, and under the auspices of the Dominicans, published several pamphlets in which he tried to demonstrate that Jewish religious writings were hostile to Christianity. Well, I'm pretty sure the public already knew that, and I'm pretty sure they were starting to read things about the Bible that contradicted the Catholic Church. And I'm pretty sure that this was damage control that needed to emancipate the Jews and to give them the upper hand once again. In the Judenspiegel, he demanded that the Jews should give up the practice of what the church deemed usury, lending money against interest. Work for their living. So this shows me that people were aware of usury was bad in the Bible. Work for their living, attend Christian sermons, and do away with books of the Talmud. On the other hand, he condemned the persecution of the Jews as an obstacle to their conversion, and in a pamphlet, Warnenspiegel defended them against charges of murdering Christian children for ritual purpose. So here we go. This is the agenda. Christian children, blood libel, and usury. In Warnenspiegel, he professed to be a friend of the Jews and desired to introduce Christianity among them to their own good. He urged them to convince the Christian world that the Jews do not need Christian blood for their religious rights, and advocate seizing the Talmud by force from them. The cause which hinder the Jews from becoming Christians, he wrote, are three. First, usury. Second, because they are not compelled to attend Christian churches to hear the sermons. And third, because they honor the Talmud. Bitterly opposed by the Jews on account of this work, he virulently attacked them. In his third pamphlet, he contradicted what he had written earlier and insisted that every Jew considers it a good deed to kill, or at least to mock a Christian. Therefore, he deemed it the duty of all true Christians to expel the Jews from all Christian lands. If the law should forbid such a deed, they do not need to obey it. It is the duty of the people to ask permission of the rulers to take from the Jews all their books except the Bible. He preached that Jewish children should be taken away from their parents and educated as Catholics. In conclusion, he wrote, "Who afflicts the Jew is doing the will of God, and who seeks their benefit will incur damnation." In the fourth pamphlet, Pfefferkorn declared that the only way to get rid of Jews was either to expel or enslave them. The first thing to be done was to collect all the copies of the Talmud found among the Jews and to burn them. Now, this kind of sounds like a pretext to World War II. Convinced that the principal source of the obduracy of the Jews lay in their books, he tried to have them seized and destroyed. He obtained from several Dominican converts recommendations to Kunigunde, the sister of the Emperor of Maximilian, and through her influence to the Emperor himself. On 19th of August 1509, Maximilian, who already had expelled the Jews from his own domains of Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, ordered the Jews to deliver to Pfefferkorn all books opposing Christianity, or the destruction of any Hebrew book except the Hebrew Bible. Pfefferkorn began the work of confiscation at Frankfurt on the Main, or possibly Magdeburg. Thence he went to Worms, Mainz, Bingen, Lauenstein, and Deutz. So the ensuing battle of the pamphlets between Pfefferkorn and Reuchlin reflected the struggle between the Dominicans and the humanists. Thus informed of Reuchlin's vote, Pfefferkorn was greatly excited and answered the Handspiegel, in which he attacked Reuchlin unmercifully. Reuchlin complained to Emperor Maximilian and answered Pfefferkorn's attack with the Eugenspiegel, against which Pfefferkorn published his Brandspiegel in June 1513. Both parties were silenced by the Emperor. Pfefferkorn, however, published in 1514 a new polemic Sturmglock against both the Jews and Reuchlin. During the controversy between Reuchlin and the theologians of Cologne, Pfefferkorn was assailed in the Epistotle Obscurum Virorum by the young humanist who espoused Reuchlin's cause. He replied in 1520, Pope Leo X declared Reuchlin guilty with a condemnation of Eugenspiegel, and Pfefferkorn wrote an expression on his triumph in Mitteldeutsche Klage. Diarmid MacLoch writes his book, The Reformation, A History, 2003, that Desiderius Erasmus was another opponent of Pfefferkorn on the grounds that he was a converted Jew and therefore could not be trusted. I don't think he can be trusted either, neither do I think any of them could be trusted. Basically, this is an Hegalian argument that started the Reformation. And what came out of the Reformation was the emancipation of the Jews, which I'll speak on later. So I found this paper, The Humanistic Fideistic Philosophy of Philip Melanchthon. And it says, this dissertation examines the way Philip Melanchthon, author of the Augsburg Confession and Martin Luther's closest co-worker, sought to establish the relationship between faith and reason in the cradle of the Lutheran tradition. Wittenberg University. While Melanchthon is widely recognized to have played a crucial role in the Reformation of the Church in the 16th century as well as in the Renaissance in Northern Europe, he has in general received relatively little scholarly attention. Few have attempted to explore his philosophy in depth, and those who have examined his philosophical work have come to contradictory or less than helpful conclusions about it. He has been rewarded as an Aristotelian, a Platonist, a philosophical eclectic, and as having been torn between Renaissance humanism and evangelical theology. And I just want to point out the relationship between the German Enlightenment period and humanism. George Lucas, German Classical Humanism, 1942. German classicism is the ideological reflex amount of the best of the German people to the events of the French Revolution, its preparation and its consequences. This very simple and historically clear statement is in sharp contrast to the entire bourgeois reactionary view of Germany's ideological heyday. The breaking of this connection, against which only Franz Mehring fought vigorously in recent times, was the basis of all reactionary legends about German classicism. In these legends, the classics' relation to the Enlightenment is initially distorted and obscured by contrasting the German classicism with the English-French Enlightenment. It is understandable that fascism, which ruthlessly endeavors to destroy or falsify all progressive traditions, derives the greatest benefits from the distortion of this connection. So what's he saying here? That the German fascism, the occult of the German fascists that come out of the 1920s and 30s, based on these German classic, return to these Aryan roots. So German classism, or Weimar classism, was a German literary and cultural movement whose practitioners established a new humanism from the synthesis of ideas from Romanticism, Classicism, and the Age of Enlightenment. Now, Romanticism is artistic, literary, music, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe towards the end of the 18th century. In most areas, it was at its peak in the approximate period from 1800 to 1850. So, we've got the music of, say, Wagner, and his romanticizing the myths of the Valkyries and the German paganism, which we know ties into the Nazi occultism. It was named after the city of Weimar, Germany, because the leading authors of Weimar classicism lived there. The Weimar classic movement lasted 30 years from 1772 to 1805 and involved intellectuals such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Johann Gottfried Herder, Friedrich Schiller, and Christoph Martin Wieland, and then was concentrated upon Goethe and Schiller during the period of 1788 to 1805. So the German Enlightenment, called neoclassical, burgeoned in the synthesis of empiricism and rationalism as developed by Christian Thomas Sayers, 1655-1728, and Christian Wolff, 1679 to 1754. This philosophy circulated wildly in the magazines and journals, profoundly directed the subsequent expansion of German-speaking and European culture. So we've got all these printed material, magazines, journals, pamphleteering happening at this time. And I believe that when the Bible first came out too, that a lot of it was printed in little bits and pieces that was secretly given out to the community. So, we've got, as I was saying earlier, this information getting out to the general public. The inability of this common sense outlook convincingly to bridge feeling and thought, body and mind, led to Immanuel Kant's epochal critical philosophy. Another, though not as abstract, approach to this problem was a governing concern with the problems of aesthetics. In Aesthetica in 1750, Alexander Baumgarten defined aesthetics, which he coined earlier in 1735, with its current intention as the science of the lower faculties, feeling, sensation, imagination, memory, which earlier figures of the Enlightenment had neglected. I don't think they were neglected. I mean, this is exactly what Hegel was talking about, the combining the natural, the earthly with the spiritual. So when we look at Encyclopedia Britannica Nazism summary, it says Nazism, or National Socialism, totalitarian movement led by Adolf Hitler as head of Germany's Nazi Party, 1920 to 1945. Nazism roots lay in the tradition of Prussian militarism and discipline and German Romanticism, which celebrated a mythic past and proclaimed the rights of the exceptional individual over all rules and laws. Nazism ideology was shaped by Hitler's belief in German racial superiority and dangers of communism. It rejected liberalism, democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, stressing instead the subordination of the individual to the state and the necessity of strict obedience to leaders. It emphasized the inequality of individuals and races and the right of the strong to rule the weak. It's hard not to see here that this, to me, is an Hegelian argument or a Hegelian manipulation. We're having this Enlightenment period, German Romanticism, then we're having this militaristic system coming out of German Romanticism and mythology. And I'm going to look into this later, but I want to question this German mythology. Is it even German history or the mythology? How German is it? I mean, to me, it's very, when we look into the roots of the beliefs of these people, it's Aryan, as they say, but it's also Persian. It's from these Asian mystery religions. And is that part of the history or culture of German people? Are German people really from this group? I don't know. I'm going to have to look into that. But my question is, are Germans being given this false narrative, nationalistic mythology on purpose? That's not really their heritage. And why would they do this? I believe they would give them this national mythology to replace Christianity, which, if we look into the identity of the lost tribes of Israel, the identity of Europe has the lost 10 tribes amongst it. I mean, we have to question this romanticism and this national pride in these beliefs that led to the Nazi Party. And ultimately, what these two world wars led to was not only earlier the emancipation of the Jews, but it forced the Jews out of Europe and back to Palestine. And, it took World War One to sign the Balfour Declaration. The Jews of Europe did not want to go back to a desert wasteland, but through the Second World War, they were forced to go back there. This is an agenda from these elitists who re-established Israel in Palestine. And I think that what I'm trying to say here is that it indicates to me that this has been a long-term plan. It's taken them centuries to make this happen. It must therefore be stated at the outset that the view that classical humanism in Germany had waged a struggle against the Enlightenment is fundamentally incorrect and does not correspond to the facts. Some of the main ideologues of this period polemicized against the German forms of Enlightenment. In order to properly understand the character of these disputes, however, we must be clear about the social character of the German Enlightenment in the middle of the 18th century, and especially at its end. The specific nature of the German Enlightenment consisted in the adoption by the petty bourgeoisie and, above all, by its intelligentsia, a small state absolutism in the attempt to soften and reform the most blatant forms of its feudal side and to adapt them to the German petty bourgeoisie understanding. In these attempts to reform the German Enlighteners have earned a great deal of merit. And anyone who knows the history of classical humanism in some detail knows that many of its leading representatives agreed with them on some issues and often differed from them only a greater decisiveness. Despite these merits, the ideology of German Enlightenment is narrow, Philistine, and ultimately often leads to a petty idealization of the existing political, social, and ideological miserability. So classical humanism in Germany has been an opposition movement from the start, the ideological attempt to unite all bourgeoisie forces against small state absolutism. Above all, it is the first ideological formulation of the striving for national unity. So this is what we had in 1930. Albeit initially only in cultural areas in an ideological historical form. For the first time in Germany, it expresses the glorification of earlier bourgeoisie democratic revolutions and their ideology. Klopstock's reception of Milton, the great poet of the English Revolution, the dramas of young Schiller and his story of the Dutch Revolution, Goethe's Egmont, the worthlessness of feudal absolutism in the small principalities, Lessing's Emilia Galotti, Schiller's Kabbalah and libel. At the same time, however, and there it goes, not only in terms of radicalism, but also in terms of quality of the German Enlightenment, it gives an extraordinary sharp criticism of petty bourgeois Philistine-like life in Germany. In doing so, however, the critical realism of German humanists rises to the point where the contradictions of bourgeois society itself are presented, and not only in directly and critically attacking forms such as the dramas of the young Lenz, but in the prophetic exposure of such contradictions in bourgeois society, which began to show themselves in the more capitalistically developed countries only in this period. Now remember that article I read saying that capitalism was the enemy of the Jew. and which only in the 19th century have become generally evident, goes Werther. This is followed by a large-scale positive portrayal of the new man in the emerging bourgeois society, in his struggle with the old reality, with his inner contradictions. Minna von Barnhelm, Nathan Faust, Prometheus, etc. Because of this breadth of decisiveness, classical humanism stands in opposition to the German Enlightenment. It means overcoming its timidity, its philistinium, its narrow and limited horizons. On the other hand, the whole German humanist movement stands consciously on the shoulders of the Franco-English Enlightenment, is its worthy continuation, and often raises its problems to a higher level. Only in one question, that the materialistic philosophy, does German humanism fall behind its own Anglo-French role models. This is a consequence of Germany's economic backwardness, where the development of the material productive forces, the social basis for the development and expansion of materialistic philosophy, had to be lacking. As far as materialism invaded Germany, it appeared in its courtly aristocratic, not in its democratically revolutionary form. Just think of the sympathy at the court of Frederick II for French materialism. In Germany, for example, the character style struggle against court materialism with its moral nihilism in the figure of Franz Moore in Schiller's Robbers could arise, and however wrong and unjust may this attack be from the standpoint of general philosophical progress, it does accurately reflect the social backwardness of Germany. This is indeed a violent and passionate attack against the feudal absolutism of the German courts, and is therefore in no exclusive contradiction to the basic social tendencies of the French Enlightenment. As a brief addition to what we have said so far, one must remember that enlighteners such as Diderot and Rousseau, such as Shaftesbury, Fielding, and Stern, were fundamental to the emergence of development of classical German humanism, and that its influence was never denied by its important representative, but on the contrary, it was enthusiastically affirmed. Says, of course, classical German humanism is not revolutionary in the sense of the French Enlightenment. At that time, German conditions were by no means pushing in the direction of creating the objective preconditions for a bourgeois democratic revolution as in France, or for an industrial revolution as in England, although it helped to mentally prepare the bourgeois revolution through its entire life work, objectively and ideologically, politically. However, it was by no means on the standpoint of a violent overthrow. Its political and social criticism sometimes show similar limits. All of this reveals Germany's backwardness to the narrowness and pettiness of its social conditions. So basically what he's saying here is that Germany had a different set of conditions that they needed to overcome and cause a revolution. Since Germany, as Marx said in the 19th century, suffered not only from the fact that its capitalism was lagging behind, but also from the fact that it was a capitalism bourgeois society, appears among the classical humanists of Germany, not only in the lagging German forms, but in the real contradictions. German classicism here continues the work of the last offshoots of the Franco-English Enlightenment, Rousseau, Stern, and Diderot in Rameau's Nephew, in which the contradictions of bourgeois society for the first time appear not as isolated phenomena, not as accidental misfortunes, but as essential features of the society. And the greatness of the German humanists consists not least in the fact that these contradictions, who in the extremely undeveloped bourgeois society of Germany could naturally only exist in the undeveloped germ form, were nevertheless grasped and represented on a very high intellectual and moral level. The underdeveloped German conditions also contributed paradoxically to this, since the backward Germany, where according to Marx, there were only decaying classes and not yet ascending classes, and class struggle and class consciousness also to the ruling class, necessarily had to be undeveloped. Important and intrepid men could deal with the contradictions of bourgeois society, especially in the abstract way we have already indicated. To think through the end with a more ruthless energy and consistency and mentally carry it out was sometimes possible in the countries of the Anglo-French Enlightenment. Thus, in his portrayal of the contradictions of capitalist society, Werther, Goethe surpasses his models Richardson and Rousseau, and so the young Hegel adopts the correct conception of capitalist society from the English economists. but recognizes in it a contradiction that inevitably had to remain hidden from Adam Smith. Here, the German humanism lies the positive downside of Germany's backwardness in economic, political, and social respect. By marking the greatest possible use of the advantages resulting from this situation, the German humanists are the most worthy heirs and fulfillers of the Anglo-French Enlightenment. What we're seeing here is the taking down of Western culture through these enlightenments and revolutions, but Germany's a whole different kettle of fish. They have to attack this in a different way. So the fulfillment of this German Enlightenment and revolutions, the Reformation, culminated in World War I and World War II. Okay, so in this paper, the dissemination of magical knowledge in Enlightenment Germany. And it says The Supernatural and the Development of Print Culture by Sabine Doring-Manteuffel. The so-called Age of Enlightenment has traditionally been portrayed as a phase of European history during which new philosophies came into existence, concerning people's ability to determine their own fate through reason. This era saw the development of future-oriented conceptions of state and society, as well as new ideas about mankind's ability to control and govern nature. The dominance of theological worldviews ceded considerable ground to secular intellectual concepts. Latin disappeared as the language of elite discourse. Increased educational provision provided access to sources of knowledge that were previously unattainable to all but a few. A market for books and newspapers, for journals and weeklies developed rapidly. More and more people lower down the social scale became increasingly involved in a literary culture. Accordingly, the common people began to learn from their history. They were taught new methods of agriculture, trade, and morals, were informed of the latest achievements and news from all over the world by self-appointed public enlighteners. As the 18th century progressed, the populace became increasingly divorced from the old traditional oral cultures and conceptions of the world. So you can see here how important it was for these people to control the narrative. You know, people printing journals and weeklies, people translating the Bible, printing it for the average person to read. So I'm just going to jump to some information regarding the printing of the Bible around this time. This is from an article from the Arizona University Libraries, and it says, after 500 years, the Protestant Reformation, the role of printing in medieval and Reformation Europe. It says, in the early 16th century, Martin Luther quickly saw the advantages of making his vernacular treatises available cheaply to a growing body of avid lay followers. His rebellion against the Catholic Church made him a celebrity, and it stimulated the publishing industry. 15th century Europe experienced a technological revolution in the invention of the printing press with movable type that bears comparison with that of computers today. Although in the earlier era, dissemination of such an invention and the realization of its effects took several generations, its transformation of the process of communication was drastic. Johann Gutenberg, a goldsmith by craft, tried to conceal his manufacture of movable type and a machine for printing with it. There were in his day no patents or copyrights to shield the inventor against pirating. The length of time needed to carve the type compelled him to borrow money on which to live, and this eventually catapulted him into bankruptcy. Before the banker Johann Fust confiscated his press and began to use it himself, typical bankers, Gutenberg managed to produce his famed 42-line Bible, dated approximately 1455, and several smaller works. The Germans generally acknowledged the discovery of printing as Gutenberg's and the method as a turning point. Wikipedia here, it says, the Gutenberg Bible, also known as the 42-line Bible, was the earliest major book printed using mass-produced movable metal type in Europe. It marked the start of the Gutenberg Revolution and the age of printed books in the West. The book is valued and revered for its high aesthetic and artistic qualities. So the Gutenberg Bible, an edition of the Vulgate, contains the Latin version of the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. It is mainly the work of St. Jerome, who began his work on the translation in 380 AD, emendations from the Parisian Bible tradition. So 49 copies have survived. They are thought to be among the world's most valuable books, although no complete copy has been sold since 1978. It says, aside from the circulation of portions of the Holy Scriptures in fragmentary or tract form, the use of tracts as an agency of religious usefulness dates from the dawn of the Reformation in Europe. Long before the invention of printing, the early reformers sent out their little tractates to awaken and instruct the people who still sat under the shadow of the Dark Ages. Well, I wouldn't call it the Dark Ages, I'd call it the Roman Catholic Church. It says Wycliffe's writings were the means of extensive usefulness. He sent out more than 100 volumes, small and great, besides his translation of the Bible. So basically, it was against the rules to read the Bible. You had to go through the priests, and people secretly printed and sent out these little tracts, portions of the Bible and religious material in a kind of alternative media to basically protest against the system that they were under. And we know from England there was a lot of people persecuted because of this, people who were under the Catholic kings and queens, but also Catholic people under the Protestant or Reformation kings and queens were persecuted. I guess what I'm pointing out here is that there was a big problem with the Reformation, but at the same time it allowed freedoms for the saints to truly seek out true information and to pursue real knowledge. Although there are some truths in the classic version of the Enlightenment, there is reason to give it only partial credence, as the study of supernatural literature of the period demonstrates. The development of printed media during the second half of the 17th century created a new information culture, which came to play a dominant role in the spread of new, more rational ideas. Yet, not all of the information disseminated immediately strikes one as being enlightened. Business-minded publishers took advantage of the continued widespread belief in magic and supernatural phenomena. Belief in miracles, magic, knowledge, and fortune-telling were exploited in the new market, and more literature that was printed in general, the more magic and occult literature was also printed. By the end of the 18th century, the market for mass-produced literature on magic and the occult had been established, and in following centuries, this literature attracted popular attention and notoriety in a number of European countries. One could see this period as giving birth to a new culture of popular magic. It was not an oral culture, but a literary culture that fostered it. Not the simple peasant, but the publisher, the printer, and the reader who cradled it. Not the rural, but the urban population which initially absorbed it. This literary occultism was a thoroughly modern phenomenon. At the same time, it was a repackaging of centuries-old ideas and rituals. The magical literature of the Enlightenment continued instructions for invocations of demons, recipes for conjuring love, and protection against harmful spells, all to be conducted in the cottage rather than the study or laboratory. It included huge numbers of works on simple divination involving, for example, magic mirrors and amateur astrology. Furthermore, the reporting of miraculous signs, which were so popular in the 16th century and 17th century, continued to play a central role in the transmission of supernaturalism. Yet, it is important to be aware of distinctions between the forms of magical beliefs mentioned above and related spiritual beliefs expressive of people's devotedness. I am more concerned with the Weltanschauung philosophy of life, which was not explicitly religious, but which was nevertheless concerned with the spiritual and derived primarily from written sources and not from the spoken word. Now, we've looked at these philosophers of this time, these German Enlightenment people, also involved with the Reformation, and we can see that they have a Hegelian or dualistic agenda. On one hand, they're doing the Kabbalah and the occult. On the other hand, they're speaking about reason and philosophy, the Greek philosophers. They're bringing this into the Christian faith. And this is how they're doing it, by introducing this occult information via these tracts or inserting it into printed religious material. In this article, they're talking about media being printed. As I mentioned, we've got the Bible being printed, people getting more educated on the truth of what the apostles said. So at the same time, we're getting these people coming into these movements and contaminating this information with the Kabbalah, with Jewish mysticism, and with Greek philosophy. Then we have Hegel, who basically his whole philosophy is based on how they work, using thesis, antithesis to gain synthesis. And even some of these Tartarian channels are using these ancient books or printings to prove that there was some kind of mystery, hidden history. These people at this time knew about this ancient Kabbalistic information, and within these prints or these images that are being created at this time, there was also a lot of deception and corruption. So we can't always trust these ancient books, or we can't always trust these ancient images to being something that is hidden from us, more possibly a media manipulation. So we can trust that they did change information and that they did try to deceive people, changing history and dates, etc. I can also see in this information how we ended up with this charismatic Christianity of today. So if people are reading this occult information, people have an affinity towards this spiritualism. And coming out of this period into the 19th century, the late 19th century, early 20th century, we started to see all of this kind of charismatic, occultist sort of Christianity, speaking in tongues and rolling all over the floor, the mesmerism of the 19th century and the occult snake oil salesman type of preachers that comes from these sort of Gnostic backgrounds. It's not biblical. Broadsiding pamphlets and newspapers. Broadsides and pamphlets were early print formats, which were already penetrating the incipient media market by the mid-16th century. In early modern Germany, the main centers of printing were Leipzig, Frankfurt, Strasbourg, Augsburg, Erfurt, and Nuremberg. Produced in towns and cities, they were brought in bulk for local markets and sold to the rural population by travelling hawkers. A similar distribution network of print peddlers selling broadsides and pamphlets still existed in the 19th century. Undoubtedly, the most popular format were the one-page broadsides, which nearly always contained illustrations and were not only used as a source of news but also as wall decorations. They have also been found glued inside the lids of trunks, boxes, and cases. So we're basically talking about tabloid media here. The majority of the 16th century broadsides and pamphlets were the products of religious propaganda. Martin Luther, one of the first media stars of print culture, demonstrated the power of simple literary forms and deliberately exploited popular formats and idioms to spread his message of religious reformation. By the second half of the 17th century, a more secular, sensational press can be distinguished. The content was, as in the past, still religious in nature, but the various elements were combined according to the principle of unit construction. It is during this period that we find early signs of standardization that characterize media in the modern period. This was made possible by new printing technology. The units of many broadsides consisted of a text and a picture. The text reported a miraculous occurrence. For example, the picture provided a graphic description for the illiterate. If it concerned a celestial sign, such as a celestial army, a flying snake, or some other indicative sign, then it filled the upper part of the picture. If, however, it concerned a miracle spring, cornfalls, or a resurrection, then a montage was created and the occurrence was superimposed into the picture of some location. These three elements, the text and the two halves of the picture, were combined at will. It thereby becomes possible to ink the sensation into a local context without having to prepare a new relief plate. By the middle of the 16th century, this technique was already being used in the printing of religious pamphlets. In 1572, for instance, the printer Nicholas Bass from Frankfurt printed a copy of a broadside about a food miracle in the Swabian village of Wiedenstetten, which the printer Peter Haag from Strasbourg also produced in the same year. The text is nearly identical, only the pictures are different. The picture used by Haag can be found again beneath another text produced by another printer. The invention of unit construction thus allowed the possibility of employing pictures and text independently of one another. Naturally, this raises the question of the purpose of such printed material. During Luther's time, the concept behind the portrayal of such miraculous occurrences was to induce a fear of God amongst the people. It was claimed that if there were an increase in earthly sins when a wrathful, avenging God would manifest himself, he threatened the world with war, famine, and plague. Should mankind continue to commit sin, then the signs would increase accordingly. The appearance of wars, famine, and plagues were to be understood as just punishment for mankind's wrongdoings. Many of the authors of pamphlets containing these kinds of messages were Lutheran preachers. They preached about God's signs to wrath, not only from the pulpit, but also the text picture medium sold at markets throughout the Protestant states. The technique was taken up by publishers in Frankfurt, Strasbourg, Leipzig, and Augsburg. As these Lutheran theories about miracle signs began to dissipate towards the end of the 17th century, and educated belief in miracles diminished due to new scientific and philosophical developments, the reports of miracle signs began to lose their religious content, but still retain their sensational value. The stories of face in the sky, celestial armies, and apparitions of angels continued to be disseminated widely. The hundreds of broadside and pamphlet reports of miraculous signs published during the late 16th and 17th centuries not only left their mark on generations of believers, but they also inspired a popular literature which during the 18th century stripped away more and more of their theological significance. Miracle showers of flour and grain were still being quite regularly reported during the first half of the 18th century. Miraculous corn stalks with 72 ears, which had been reported near Strasbourg back in the 16th century, continued to turn up 200 years later. So, to me, this seems like a Hegelian agenda. You could have a mutated cornstalk that grows more ears, 72 ears. I don't know. I mean, this sounds kind of like they're using the early use of media to manipulate people. Wheat and flour falling from the sky is pretty ridiculous. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is a National Enquirer story. God just doesn't work that way. I just posted an image a few seconds ago about liturgy and, during the period of the Catholic Church when people weren't allowed to read or couldn't read, they had to go through the priest. The Catholic Church would use music and they would use images in their liturgy to try to educate people on their doctrine. I don't see anything different with this period of pamphleteering. So I was of the opinion that the Reformation was a great thing, and I still agree the Reformation or this time period was a good thing for the education of the average person to get away from the controlling factor of the priest system. But I will be honest, I'm actually quite shocked at how many people are involved in the Reformation that have suspect backgrounds. I believe in a Christian anarchy, really. I think that is an anarchy against the state, not an anarchy against God, obviously, because there is a hierarchy in heaven. But, Jesus tells us we'll be kings and we'll be priests. And that means that we have the ability to discern for ourselves. We do not need a priest to tell us how to do things, and we do not need a king to give us rules to be just or righteous people. We are that ourselves based on the kingdom of God. In the kingdom, we are those things. We're given the heart to be those people, and we don't need to be children told what to do by kings or priests. We're told to call no man father. we only have the Father in heaven, like Jesus spoke to the Father in heaven. And we look at words like patriotic, and that is saying that the system or the national identity is our father, matriarch, patriarch. We don't need a father and mother in a system or a government. So I'm going to go off on a tangent here, and I've found some information on Martin Luther that makes me think he may have been actually set up to lead the church down a certain direction. Now, I'm not saying the Reformation was a bad thing or that people within the Reformation were all bad people, because I think there were most certainly some really great people involved in this event in history. But I think that there were also some people placed amongst the Reformation that were designed to lead the Reformation in a direction that was controlled opposition. We've got the Jesuit Counter-Reformation. I've showed that a lot of these people involved in the Reformation had Jesuit family and friends. They were of suspect background. And it says here, was Martin Luther a Rosicrucian? The rose, together with the cross, is a sign of the Rosicrucian order as seen below. So we've got the rose and cross here. The cross symbolizes Christianity, and the rose often symbolizes secrecy. Martin Luther's seal is also the rose and the cross, united, but differently. So here we've got Martin Luther's symbol. It's a rose with a cross in the center. It would be difficult to imagine that Martin Luther was not aware of the Rosicrucians, and even more difficult that his seal would happen by chance. Therefore, is there a link between the Rosicrucian order and the Protestant Reformation? So in this information here, it says Martin Luther, another Rosicrucian Freemason. The Reformers were Mary-honouring Masons. The Vatican's former priest, Martin Luther, was a Rosicrucian Mason and Masonic, most probably Kabbalist. It says here, the new Reformation religiously, politically, and economically. It is therefore widely believed that with the Reformation, the capstone on the Masonic pyramid, the Jewish Kabbalist Sanhedrin, in combination with their powerful workhorse, the Illuminati, secretly sponsored John Chauvin and the other reformers to break away from Catholicism to found a Protestantism, a new religion that would transform the world, not just religiously and politically, but economically as well. In this page, we've got some information about the Reformers. It says the rise of capitalism and Protestant Reformation, the communist comrade Jesus of the Protestant Reformation, Master Calvin, the Dutch Reformed Methodist Pope of Geneva and his false kingdom of Christ, and human sacrifice of the Reformers. John Calvin's most infamous human sacrifice to Satan. So human sacrifice of the Mary-worshipping Masonic Protestant Reformers. It says the Greek mythology, Platonism, the wisdom of God is called Sophia, while Shekinah, the glory of God, is the fertility goddess of the Masonic Jewish Kabbalah. The Kabbalah Shekinah is also the divine feminine and the soul of God and man. Gleaned from paganism and the particular Masonic orders, these goddesses were Christianized by the Vatican as the feminine god mother, Mary, secretly worshipped as the Holy Spirit of the Trinity. So we now know that this Sophia of Greek philosophy comes from the Persian Zoroastrian belief. Then we have the Kabbalah, which is Chaldean, or as I like to say, the Nabatean Edomites. And we have all these reformers and philosophers of this time period preaching a dualistic and Gnostic version of the Bible, as they did in the beginning of the Roman Catholic Church. As seen below in the Masonic Science, the Catholic statements of the Reformers, it is clear that they did not really repent from Mary worship. And we've got Martin Luther here saying the veneration of Mary is inscribed in the very depths of the human heart. Martin Luther. John Calvin, it cannot be denied that God, in choosing and destining Mary to be the mother of his son, granted her the highest honor. Ulrich Zwingli, I esteem immensely the mother of God, the ever-chaste, immaculate Virgin Mary. Above the first three images from left, the former Catholics turned reformers, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and others, confessed their allegiance to the Roman Catholic Holy Spirit, Mother Mary or Earth Goddess, not the true God of the Bible. With some variations, the Reformers all accepted this Mother of God of Roman Catholic dogma. However, the real Mary of the Bible was merely the human mother of the man Jesus Christ. God has no mother, Hebrews 7:3. Jesus is without father, mother, genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. So the last image on the right, the Masonic sign of John Calvin, father of the Dutch and other Calvinist churches. In Masonry, the supreme being is called the architect of the universe, Wikipedia wrote. John Calvin, in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, repeatedly calls the Christian God the architect of the universe, also referring to his works as architecture of the universe. In the commentary on Psalms 19, Calvin also refers to the Christian God as the great architect or architect of the universe. So pre-Lutheran John Wycliffe, translator of the Bible from Latin to English, showed his Masonic sign and declared, "It seems to me impossible that we should obtain the reward of heaven without the help of Mary. There is no sex or age or rank or position of anyone in the whole human race which has no need to call for the help of the Holy Virgin." John Wesley's Anglican Methodist reformer Calvin's right hand in Scotland also affirmed the perpetual virginity of Mary, the Mother of God. Thus, one still finds the Roman Catholic Madonna and Child with votive candle rack and prie-dieu in Methodist churches. So, Bible truth, 1 Timothy 2, verse 5, there is one God, one mediator between God and men, and the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as atonement for all. Above the last three images left, the unmistakable Masonic hand on the heart sign of John Calvin, John Wycliffe, and Martin Luther has a number of Masonic meanings, but mostly it declares that they belong to Lucifer, the devil, whom all Masonic orders worship. Well, they worship the light, and that light is Sophia, so it would make sense what they're saying about Mary here. So the teachings of Masonic societies mostly adhere to 72 signs from the heart of the Celestial Mother. Well, it's kind of funny because we're just talking about the corn stalk that had 72 ears of corn on it. Is that a Masonic symbol in the early pamphlets of the Enlightenment period? Another name for Isis, Semiramis, etc., the fertility goddess, which Catholics worship as Mother Mary. The Vatican's involvement and use of secret societies and terrorist organizations undoubtedly revealed that hidden powers behind and religion had a special plan with the Reformation. The Reformers, as evidenced at the top of the page, were all Mary-honoring Masons. The Vatican's former priest Martin Luther was a Rosicrucian Mason and a Masonic, most probably Kabbalist. John Calvin was a clandestine Jew called Chauvin. Some say this is untrue. Chauvin is French for Calvin. It is therefore widely believed that the Reformation, the capstone on the Masonic pyramid, the Jewish Kabbalist Sanhedrin, in combination with their powerful workhorse, the Illuminati, secretly sponsored John Calvin and all the other reformers to break away from Catholicism to found Protestantism, a new religion that would transform the world, not just religiously and politically, but economically as well. Well, and as I was saying, what came out of the Reformation and the Enlightenment period was the emancipation of the Jews and what I believe the unchaining of the dragon, the freedom for this group of the Nabatean priesthood, in my opinion, the Chaldeans, or those that call themselves Jews according to Revelation, and they had the ability to do what they wanted to society, to go to war against the saints. Erudite discourses by Erasmus Francisci passed on these kind of stories to his readers with the intention of proving the existence of ghosts. In other publications, he actually referred directly to a miracle sign report by Job Finkel, yep, that's a trustworthy surname, of Erfurt, believing it to be a reliable source of information about an omen of war, namely an invisible army seen in a field in Saxon in 1553. Finkel was an ardent Lutheran preacher and one of the most reputable creators of such miracle reports. With Francisci, however, the story became less a piece of Protestant propaganda and more a justification for the existence of demons and ghosts. He no longer believed that the omen really was a prophecy of war, but he was convinced that the apparitions were genuine. So possibly this is the same guy. Jobus Finkelus was a 16th century humanist and physician born Heo Finkel or Finzel. He studied at Erfurt, Jena, and Wittenberg before becoming a master of philosophy in Wittenberg. In 1562, he was professor and assistant of medicine at Weimar. In 1568, he was a physician at Zwickau. He was of Erfurt, and he was a reliable source of information, which was believed to be seen in 1553. So it's quite possible it's the same guy, same time period. He studied at Erfurt. So, this particular Wikipedia page is saying that he's a humanist and a physician and a philosopher. And this article here, Finkel was an ardent Lutheran preacher. So what was he? A humanist or a philosopher? Or was he a Lutheran preacher? You tell me. So according to Oxford Academia, it says that he was a Lutheran natural philosopher, Job Finkel, who in the politically troubled years in the mid-16th century published 3 widely read volumes of natural signs and miracles under the title Wonder Signs, fueled by a sense that he was living in the world's final days. There had been an explosive development in the newspaper market. The first German language newspaper had already been printed in the early 17th century, but the periodical press really took off commercially during the 18th century. In Augsburg, for example, which had long been an influential media and printing center, the handful of newspapers produced during the early 18th century swelled to around 200. By the end of the century, some of them, such as Intelligenzblätter, contain a rubric with mixed messages. And here we come across the sign reports again. By this time, they were reduced to mere textual announcements. The simple illustrations, which were one of the main selling points of the broadside and chapbook, were not replicated in a newspaper format. Now, remember that also Reuters come out of this era, and the Rothschilds worked with Reuters for their propaganda machine. So I could go on and on and on about these reformers and the Jesuit backgrounds. A lot of them have the suspect backgrounds and family origins, names, genealogy. But I'll leave that up to you to decide. What I really want to focus on is this emancipation and Enlightenment period. And as I said, this particular person, Ferdinand Christian Bauer, in the next video. And I'd like to show how it changed the Christian church for the worst. But at the end of the day, it's all in the plan of God, and that we must overcome this great deception and learn the truth. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next episode.